Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to try to tackle this question that has some pretty major implications for the future of Europe.
hmm
Why does Europe seem to be lagging behind
Yeah.
the U.S. and China when it comes to developing that cutting-edge technology,
Yeah.
the disruptive innovations that completely change the game?
Right.
Um,
Things like
right.
artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
You've got semiconductors and cloud computing.
Exactly.
Those are the areas where U.S. and Chinese companies are really pulling ahead.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this is we're actually diving into an academic policy brief
Okay.
today
Interesting.
called Cost of Failure and Competitiveness in Disruptive Innovation. Let's try to understand this. Now, I know you're thinking,
Right.
cost of failure? What does that even have to do with Europe's tech scene?
Right.
But get this. This brief makes this surprising connection between how difficult it is for European companies to let people go.
Oh, interesting.
We're talking employment protection laws, or
Yeah.
EPL, and their willingness to invest in risky, groundbreaking tech ventures.
It's almost like their social safety net.
Yeah.
Which is a great thing for workers could unintentionally be holding back their tech sector.
Okay, so before we get too deep into this,
Yeah.
let's set the stage here.
Right.
This tech gap between Europe and the U.S., it's real,
Yeah.
and it's growing.
It is a growing problem for sure.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about like a small difference here.
Right.
Like the policy brief points out that private R&D spending in the US tech sector
Yeah.
is 6 times higher than in Europe.
6 times.
6 times. That's a huge difference.
Yeah, that's massive.
And China's not too far behind either.
Yeah, so what does that mean, like, practically speaking?
Well, fewer European companies are leading the charge in those key areas that we talked about.
Right.
And this has big implications, not just economically, but also geopolitically.
Yeah.
Technology is becoming increasingly intertwined with national security. So Europe falling behind could become a real problem.
So everyone kind of recognizes that there's this gap,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So what's the explanation? Is it just that Europeans just aren't as entrepreneurial?
You hear that a lot,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That there's something about European culture that's just less risk-taking.
Yeah.
But this policy brief actually pushes back on a lot of these common assumptions.
Like what? Fill me in.
Well, they address things like market fragmentation.
Yeah.
The idea that Europe's many different countries and languages makes it hard to scale up businesses.
Right.
And they look at regulations, public subsidies, and even access to funding.
Yeah.
And all of these things might play a role,
Right.
but they're not the whole story.
So what is the main culprit, according to this brief?
The cost of failure.
Okay.
And
Wow.
essentially what that means is how expensive and difficult it is for companies to shut down projects that aren't working.
Yeah.
Particularly when it involves letting employees go.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going.
Yeah. EPL comes into play here.
This is exactly where it comes in.
Yeah.
Because in disruptive innovation, you got to think about it.
Right.
Most new ventures
Fail.
fail. They fail.
Right.
But if failing is too costly, companies are less likely to take those big swings in the first place.
So in Europe, where EPL is generally much stricter,
Yeah.
especially for larger companies,
Especially.
the cost of failure is higher, and that discourages companies from investing
Right.
in risky innovations.
It's just too risky.
That's their argument.
That's the argument.
Man,
And they have some pretty compelling examples.
give me one.
Okay.
Something that really drives this point home.
So let's think about it this way.
Okay.
Imagine you're a tech giant
Oh.
and you need to pivot fast.
Yeah.
In the U.S., you're Microsoft.
Okay.
You're making these tough calls. Laying off 10,000 people earlier this year
Wow.
and shifting resources to AI development.
Okay.
In Europe, you're Nokia.
You're facing similar challenges,
Yeah.
but you're stuck in this bureaucratic maze for years just to reduce your workforce by 14,000.
Wow.
That's the speed difference we're talking about.
That's a stark contrast.
It is.
And I imagine the financial costs are pretty different too.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
In the U.S., severance for tech workers might be a few months of pay,
Right.
but in many European countries, it can be years of salary.
Oh, wow.
And that's a huge hit to the bottom line for any company
Yeah.
thinking about making a risky bet.
So stricter EPL makes failing more expensive,
Right.
which makes companies less likely to try these risky innovations.
Yeah.
Got it.
Got it.
But how does this impact the European tech scene as a whole? Like, is it really that big of a deal?
Well, It's a bigger deal than you might think. This is where, like, that domino effect comes in.
Domino effect.
Yeah, you got to think about it. If big companies are hesitant to take risks,
Uh-huh.
it impacts the whole ecosystem.
So what do you mean by that? Like, how does it affect startups?
Okay, so let's say a large company is thinking about acquiring a startup,
Right.
but they know that acquiring a European startup might mean years of like restructuring headaches,
Okay.
massive severance costs.
Yeah.
Down the line, they might think twice about it.
I see what you're saying. So the cost of failure doesn't just affect the companies directly involved in like a failed project.
Right.
It kind of casts this shadow over the entire investment landscape.
Exactly, and that makes European startups less attractive
Right.
to investors,
Yeah.
including venture capitalists.
Uh-huh.
The policy brief actually compares the returns of U.S. versus European venture capital funds,
Hmm.
and the numbers are really striking.
Okay.
U.S. funds have historically seen much higher returns,
Right.
partly because they're more comfortable with risk.
So it's like a vicious cycle.
It is.
Less capital for European startups means fewer big wins,
Right.
which then further reinforces that idea that Europe is lagging behind.
Exactly. And that brings us to potential solutions.
Right.
Now, all of this, might make you think that Europe's doomed in this tech race.
Right.
But the policy brief offers kind of a glimmer of hope.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued.
They point to Denmark.
Denmark? Really?
Yeah.
What do they know about disruptive innovation?
Well, you might be surprised. Denmark has this interesting model called Flexi Security.
Flexi Security.
Flexi Security, essentially, they combine easy layoffs with a really strong social safety net. So companies have the flexibility to adapt quickly while workers are still protected.
I see the appeal, but wouldn't that be like incredibly expensive to implement?
Yeah.
And could it even work in other European countries that have, different social structures?
I mean, those are valid questions.
Right.
But what the policy brief proposes
Okay.
is applying this model selectively.
It's selectively.
Yeah, focusing on top earners.
Top earners. Okay.
Like the top 5 to 10% of salaries.
So those like highly skilled tech workers that we were talking about earlier, the ones that are in high demand and could easily find new jobs even if they were laid off?
Exactly. The idea is that these individuals don't really need the same level of job protection. And loosening the EPL for this group could actually unlock a lot of innovation potential.
Right.
Without, undermining the broader social safety net.
So it's like targeted EPL reform.
Yeah.
Designed to boost this disruptive innovation.
Exactly.
Are there any other countries that have tried something similar to this?
Yeah, the policy brief mentions Austria and Sweden
Okay.
as having, elements of this approach.
Okay.
They have slightly different systems, but the core idea is pretty similar.
Yeah.
It's finding ways to balance worker protection
Right.
with the flexibility that companies need to innovate.
I'm curious, what kind of data do we have that supports this idea that this kind of targeted approach would actually work?
Well, that's where things get a little bit tricky.
Okay.
The policy brief actually highlights this lack of detailed data on actual restructuring costs. We have the big picture. We know that severance costs are generally higher in Europe.
Right.
But, the specifics are hard to come by.
Why is that? Why don't we have more data on this?
Well, I mean, think about it from a company's perspective.
Yeah.
The nitty-gritty details of the restructuring processes, including severance negotiations and costs, are highly confidential.
Okay.
They're not going to share that information lightly.
So we're trying to solve this complex puzzle.
Yeah.
But we've got these missing pieces.
Yeah.
It makes it hard to know for sure what the impact of EPL is.
Right.
And how to, fine-tune policies for optimal results.
Exactly. It's definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
It's almost like the authors of the policy brief are issuing a call to action. They're urging researchers and policymakers to try to find ways to gather more data on these restructuring costs while, respecting companies' confidentiality concerns.
I think more transparency and better data would really help us understand this issue a lot more deeply.
Yeah, for sure.
But even with the data we do have,
Yeah.
this policy brief makes a pretty compelling argument.
It does.
It seems like Europe's strong social safety nets,
Yeah.
the ones that are normally seen as a good thing,
Yeah.
might actually be unintentionally holding it back.
Yeah.
when it comes to competing in this fast-paced world
It's tough.
of disruptive innovation.
Yeah, it creates this domino effect,
Right.
that impacts not just the big players, but also those up-and-coming startups.
Yep.
The ones that could be the next Google or Amazon.
Exactly. And, this policy brief lays out a really compelling case.
It does?
But I think it also leaves us with some pretty thought-provoking questions
It does.
that it doesn't directly answer.
Yeah. For example,
Yeah.
could targeted EPL reforms for top earners really be the key to unlocking Europe's potential?
Right.
Or are there, deeper cultural or structural factors at play here that need to be addressed?
Yeah.
It's not a simple fix.
No, it's definitely not.
There's a lot going on.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Right.
But I have to say, this deep dive has given me some really new perspectives.
Yeah.
Who would have thought that something like employment protection laws could have such a big impact on this global tech scene?
It's fascinating, isn't it? It really highlights how these seemingly unrelated policies can have these ripple effects across entire industries.
It's true.
And it really underscores the importance of understanding those connections
Yeah.
if we want to make informed decisions about the future.
For sure. For sure. Well, if you're as intrigued by this as I am,
Yeah.
I highly recommend checking out the policy brief itself.
It is a bit of a dense read.
It is a little dense,
But
it's well worth it.
It is.
And don't worry, we'll include a link in the show notes so you can easily find it.
Absolutely. And for those of you who want to explore this topic further,
Yeah.
there are tons of other resources out there that delve into European innovation policies and the challenges of competing in the global tech world. Don't be afraid to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah. Explore. Keep digging.
Keep learning.
Well, that's it for this week's deep dive into the world of disruptive innovation and the surprising role of employment protection laws.
It's pretty fascinating.
It is. We hope you've enjoyed this journey with us.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and never stop